Picture the scene. A private study inside Buckingham Palace, early morning, the kind of gray London light that makes the gold frames on the portraits look dull rather than grand. King Charles sits at a desk that has been used by monarchs for generations, surrounded by the accumulated weight of institutional history, and he is reading a briefing document. The document is detailed, professionally prepared, and covers the monarchy's strategic response to the most serious royal crisis of the decade. It outlines decisions that have already been made. It describes actions that have already been taken. It references conversations that occurred without him. He did not commission this briefing. He did not assemble the team that prepared it. In the most technically precise sense, he is still the king. In every other sense that matters in the room where this briefing was prepared, the question of who is actually running things has already been answered. The British monarchy has a king. What it may no longer have, in any meaningful operational sense, is a ruler. And the most fascinating, most unsettling, most historically significant aspect of what is currently unfolding inside Buckingham Palace is not the question everyone is asking, is William taking over, but the deeper, harder question that almost nobody is asking loudly enough: at what precise point did the transfer of real power already happen? Was it a decision Charles made consciously and willingly, the act of a wise king preparing his successor with deliberate care? Was it something that crept up on him, that happened incrementally through months of crisis management and health struggles, and 100 small moments where the younger generation moved faster and more decisively than the older one could? Or is the distinction between those two versions of events one that the palace narrative has very carefully collapsed, presenting as a graceful handover what was in some important ways a quiet displacement? The arrest of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on February 19, 2026, on his 66th birthday at his temporary cottage on the Sandringham estate, held for 11 hours on suspicion of sharing sensitive government documents with Jeffrey Epstein, was the moment the transfer became visible to the outside world. The crisis that followed, the decisions that were made in response to it, the specific way that authority flowed through the palace in the days and weeks afterward, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion that people inside the institution had been quietly reaching for months. Prince William was not waiting. He had not been waiting for some time. And the monarch, who was officially in charge of the institution William was directing, was sitting in his private study, reading briefings that described what his son had already decided. This is the story of how that happened. Not the simplified version where an ailing king steps graciously aside for a capable heir, and not the dramatic version where a son seizes power from a weakened father. The real version, which is more complicated and more human than either of those narratives, and which requires sitting with a certain amount of ambiguity about what exactly is being lost and gained in the transfer currently underway. Because what is happening inside the House of Windsor right now is not simply a succession. It is a renegotiation of what the monarchy is, what it is for, and who gets to define those answers. And the person most profoundly affected by that renegotiation is not the man losing power or the man gaining it. It is the woman who worked for decades to earn a title, whose authority is being quietly redefined around her before she has had the chance to fully inhabit it. Stay with this. Because the story of William's ascent and Camilla's isolation and Charles's complicated role in both of those things is not a story about palace gossip or family drama, even though it contains both. It is a story about institutions, about the specific kind of power that exists outside formal authority, and about what happens when a generational transfer of leadership happens faster than anyone planned and in conditions that nobody would have chosen. There is a particular kind of authority that cannot be granted by any title or any formal transfer of responsibility. It accumulates slowly through the specific experience of having been correct about important things when the people around you chose not to listen. Prince William has been building that authority for years, and the events of early 2026 delivered its final installment in the most public way imaginable. But to understand the full weight of what that authority now represents inside the palace, You have to understand not just what William said in 2019, but what it cost him to say it and to keep saying it across the years when nobody was ready to act. After Andrew's catastrophic BBC Newsnight interview in 2019, the pizza restaurant alibi, the baffling justifications, the complete and total absence of empathy for Jeffrey Epstein's victims, William went directly to both King Charles, then still Prince of Wales, and to the late Queen Elizabeth, and told them what needed to happen. Andrew had to be removed from royal duties immediately. Not gradually, not through a carefully managed public distancing, but immediately and completely. He framed it not as a personal judgment about his uncle, but as an institutional necessity. Public confidence in the monarchy was hanging by a thread, he said. Protecting the institution had to take precedence over protecting any individual within it, regardless of blood ties. The argument was clear, the logic was impeccable, and it was set aside. The Queen, in the final years of her life, was not prepared to act with the severity her grandson was advocating. Her son, whatever his failings and whatever the damage his conduct was causing, was still her son. Charles, caught between his mother's protective instinct and his own genuine alarm about Andrew's behavior, deferred to the Queen's position. The family closed around its own in the way that families do, and William's warnings were absorbed into the institutional machinery and quietly filed away. He was outvoted by sentiment. And then he waited. What the waiting produced, over the years that followed, was not bitterness, or at least not primarily bitterness. It produced something more useful to the situation William was preparing for. It produced the specific, unassailable credibility that comes from being the person who saw something coming and said so clearly and was ignored and was then proven correct in the most expensive possible way. When Andrew was arrested on February 19, 2026, there was nobody inside the palace who needed to be reminded that William had been advocating for this outcome. Andrew's complete separation from the institution since 2019. The memory was institutional. The authority it conferred on William's current judgments was real and immediate. If he had been right about Andrew 7 years ago, when everyone around him wanted to believe otherwise, the implicit question hanging over every subsequent decision was obvious. What else has he been right about that the people around him have been choosing not to hear? That question, unspoken but present in every meeting and every briefing and every decision of consequence taken in the palace during the early months of 2026, is the source of William's real power. Not his title, not his proximity to the throne, not even the formal authority that Charles has delegated to him over the management of the Andrew crisis. The source of his power is the demonstrated record of having been correct when it was costly and inconvenient to be correct, and the institutional memory of every person in the room who remembers that record and adjusts their behavior accordingly. Sources close to the royal family have described William's role in the 6 months preceding Andrew's arrest as central to every major decision about his uncle: the stripping of titles in October 2025, the termination of the Royal Lodge lease, the complete and formal severing of Andrew from the institutional framework. This was not insider's stress, Charles acting alone with William offering occasional input. This was William leading the strategy, with Charles providing the formal constitutional authority that made it executable. The distinction matters. One is a king directing his heir. The other is an heir directing his king. And the evidence, assembled carefully from the accounts of those present at the relevant meetings and decisions, points consistently toward the second description. It would be too simple and too unkind to describe what is happening to King Charles as a loss of control. The reality is more nuanced than that and more poignant, and understanding it requires sitting with a degree of complexity that the simplified narratives of royal commentary rarely accommodate. Charles became king in September 2022 at the age of 73. He was the oldest person ever to ascend the British throne, and he had waited longer than anyone in history for the moment. The weight of that wait, the decades of preparation. The accumulated frustration of watching the role he had spent his life preparing for remain perpetually out of reach was visible in the relief and the gravity of his early public appearances as monarch. This was not a man who took his inheritance lightly. This was a man who had been thinking about how to be king since he was a child and who arrived at the throne with more accumulated institutional knowledge and more considered ideas about what the role should involve than any of his predecessors. In February 2024, 17 months into that reign, he was diagnosed with cancer. The type has not been publicly disclosed. Treatment began immediately and continued throughout 2024 and into 2025 and beyond. The physical toll of that treatment, combined with the demands of a role that requires constant public presence and engagement, has been visible in ways that palace communications have managed carefully, but cannot entirely conceal. Then, in March 2024, came the second blow. Kate announced her own cancer diagnosis, meaning that both the king and the wife of the heir to the throne were simultaneously in treatment. The emotional and institutional weight of that coincidence was considerable. In 2025, Charles granted William and Kate the authority to issue royal warrants, the ability to publicly endorse products and brands on behalf of the crown. This specific act has been described in various commentaries as a routine administrative transfer, a symbolic gesture, a sign of the king's confidence in his heir. All of those descriptions contain some truth. But within the institutional language of the monarchy, where actions communicate meaning that words rarely capture, the grant of royal warrant authority to a still living heir carries a significance that goes beyond administration. It is the kind of act that previous monarchs have guarded jealously, precisely because its transfer acknowledges something about the relative institutional standing of the two parties involved that formal hierarchies prefer to leave unacknowledged. One royal source told a national newspaper that Charles was not simply helping William realize his potential, but actively guiding him through decisions that would define the institution for decades, knowing that the future of the monarchy rested with the whales. The phrasing is careful and the sentiment is generous. But there's a version of that same statement that sounds different depending on which part of it you emphasize. A king guiding his heir through important decisions is a story about wisdom and mentorship. A king whose heir is making the important decisions while the king provides guidance is a story about something else. Both versions may be true simultaneously. The question of which one is more true is one that the palace has a strong institutional interest in not answering directly. William's vision for the monarchy is not new. He has been developing it for years, testing it in the spaces where he has had the freedom to build from his own instincts rather than inheriting someone else's structure. But the Andrew crisis has given it an urgency and a public visibility that it did not previously have. And the result is that a set of ideas that might once have seemed like the long-term preferences of a thoughtful heir are now being applied in real time to an institution in the middle of a serious reputational emergency. The Royal Foundation, the charitable organization he runs with Kate, is the most frequently cited model for what William wants the monarchy to eventually look like. It has a chief executive. It has a board of directors with defined responsibilities and terms. It sets measurable goals and reports on them publicly. The opacity that has historically insulated royal operations from external scrutiny is simply not part of how it functions. When William talks about wanting the monarchy to operate more like a modern company, with clear reporting structures and transparent decision-making and professional management that replaces the inherited authority of longtime courtiers, the foundation is the proof of concept. He is not proposing something theoretical. He is proposing to scale something that already exists and already works. His management of the Duchy of Cornwall, the vast and complex estate he inherited when Charles became king, has given those who watch it closely a more granular picture of what that management style looks like in practice. People familiar with his approach describe him as someone who consistently and without apology questions inherited ways of doing things. Not to be disruptive for its own sake, but because he genuinely believes that institutions, which cannot explain why they do what they do, are institutions that are already in the process of failing, even if the failure is not yet visible. One insider summarized his governing philosophy in a phrase that has since circulated widely within palace circles. Accountability is at the heart of everything the prince and princess do. They want the monarchy to be known for doing well and benefiting others. It must be fit for purpose. In October 2025, in a conversation with Canadian actor Eugene Levy that was deliberately informal in its setting and deliberately candid in its content, William said that change was on his agenda. He acknowledged the specific challenge of that ambition, bringing about real transformation in an institution whose symbolic value rests precisely on the appearance of continuity. The tension is genuine, and he knows it. A former royal aide offered the most memorable formulation of it. The monarchy, the aide said, is like a jar of Marmite. The label has looked the same for generations. But the contents have been quietly and continuously replaced. What William is attempting is to make the replacement of the contents more deliberate, more structured, and ultimately more defensible to a public that is increasingly unwilling to accept that tradition alone is a sufficient justification for anything. Not everyone inside the institution is enthusiastic about this vision. The people who are alarmed by it are not necessarily traditionalists resistant to change for its own sake. Some of them are people who understand that institutions rebuilt around one individual's philosophy at speed during a crisis tend to look more durable than they are. The question of whether William's corporate monarchy is genuinely more robust than what it replaces, or whether it simply transfers the concentration of informal authority from a network of courtiers to a single heir and his strategically capable wife, is one that will take years to answer. But it is already being asked quietly by people inside the palace who are watching the transformation with more ambivalence than the official narrative acknowledges. The story of Queen Camilla in 2026 is, when you strip away the palace politics and the strategic analysis and the question of who is winning the institutional power struggle, a story about timing, about arriving at the destination you have been working toward for decades and discovering that the map has been redrawn while you were traveling. Camilla spent the better part of 30 years rehabilitating a public image that had been formed in the worst possible circumstances. She was cast in the public narrative of the 1990s as the villain in the most beloved royal love story of her generation. The process of moving past that, casting through consistent public service, through literacy, advocacy, and domestic violence awareness and support for military families, through the patient accumulation of visible, genuine work was neither quick nor easy. She did it anyway. She showed up to engagements that received no press coverage. She supported causes that generated no glamour. She built a record of service that could not be dismissed as performance because it was too consistent and too unglamorous to be anything other than genuine. When Charles became king in 2022, she became queen consort in a way that a significant portion of the public had come to accept, if not entirely embrace. She had done what the institution required of her and received what the institution had promised. She had earned it in the only way it could be earned, through time and through work, and through the specific kind of stubborn persistence that comes from being committed to something that you are not entirely sure will ever fully arrive. What she could not have fully anticipated was that she would arrive at her position at precisely the moment when the next generation was already taking over. Not displacing her formally, nobody has moved to strip her of her title or diminish her ceremonial role. But the informal power that a queen consort has historically wielded through her relationship with the king, through her access to the decision-making conversations that shape the institution's direction, has been quietly and systematically transferred to a different partnership, the partnership of William and Kate. The conflict over Sarah Ferguson has been widely reported as a straightforward, strategic disagreement. William believes Camilla's friendship with Ferguson, whose name appears in the Epstein documents, constitutes an unacceptable reputational risk. Camilla believes that 50 years of genuine friendship cannot and should not be ended because of guilt by association. Both positions are coherent. Both contain real moral weight. What is interesting about the conflict is not who is right in the abstract, but what it reveals about the specific ways in which the two generations understand loyalty. For William, loyalty to the institution is the primary obligation, and personal relationships that compromise that loyalty must be subordinated to it, regardless of their history or their depth. For Camilla, who has navigated decades of institutional pressure on her personal life, the idea that her private friendships should be managed as institutional assets is not a new demand, but it is one she has reached the point of being unwilling to accept. When Camilla met with French abuse survivor Giselle Pellicot in February 2026 as part of her ongoing advocacy for survivors of sexual violence, the public response was corrosive. Social media critics argued that she could not credibly champion abuse survivors in public while maintaining a private friendship with someone whose name was embedded in the Epstein files. Whether or not that criticism was fair, and a reasonable argument can be made that it was not the damage it produced was real, her genuine advocacy work was turned into a liability. And the person whose institutional strategy had created the conditions for that outcome, by insisting on a public positioning of the monarchy that made Camilla's private relationships more rather than less visible as a problem, was Prince William. She finds herself in a position where even the things she does right are being used against her. Kate's emergence as a central figure in the management of the Andrew crisis was not, for anyone paying close attention, a surprise. It was the public visibility of something that had been building for a long time, and that her cancer treatment and recovery had, paradoxically, accelerated rather than interrupted. When Kate stepped away from public duties in early 2024 following her cancer diagnosis and the beginning of chemotherapy, the royal family lost something that it had come to rely on without fully acknowledging how much, not her ceremonial presence, though that was missed, her operational judgment. The specific quality of attention she brings to the management of public perception and institutional messaging, quiet, thorough, attentive to detail in a way that rarely generates headlines but consistently produces the right outcomes. The months of her absence were, in retrospect, a useful demonstration of the difference her presence makes. She came back different, not in the fundamental qualities of her character or her approach, but in the quality of her assurance. There is a particular transformation that serious illness sometimes produces in public figures, a stripping away of whatever performative dimension their public presence contained. A directness and a certainty that comes from having navigated something genuinely hard and emerged with their own sense of themselves intact. The Kate who returned to public duties in the second half of 2024 carried herself with an authority that was not borrowed from her title or her marriage, but appeared to originate from somewhere more internal. People noticed, the public noticed, the institution noticed, and the people who had known her for years, who understood the gap between how she had always carried herself in public and how she now carried herself, understood that what they were observing was not a performance of recovery. It was the real thing. A woman who had been through something very hard and had come out of it knowing herself more clearly, and who was now bringing that self-knowledge to every room she walked into with a completeness that changed the quality of attention in those rooms. When Andrew was arrested in February 2026 and the palace needed to manage the crisis response in real time, it was Kate who was visible beside William at public engagements in the days that followed, projecting the stability and the composure that the institution desperately needed the world to see. It was Kate who was working with palace staff on the public communications strategy, consulting with legal advisors, ensuring that William's approach was implemented with the precision it required. She was functioning, in the plainest possible description of what was happening, as a co-chief executive of the institution during its most serious recent emergency. Camilla's response to this visibility has been described by insiders as a mixture of genuine grievance and wounded dignity. She feels, the accounts suggest, that Kate's increasing centrality in institutional decision-making reflects badly on her own position, that it communicates to the world that the current queen consort is not capable of managing a crisis of this magnitude, without the next generation stepping in to compensate. Charles, in the accounts of those present at the relevant moments, has consistently defended Kate against Camilla's criticisms, pointing out that her involvement reflects a desire to help rather than any intention to undermine. That the king is defending his daughter-in-law against his wife's objections, and doing so repeatedly and without apparent ambivalence, is itself a data point of considerable significance about where the informal alignments within the family currently sit. In late February 2026, the tension between William and Camilla reached a point that sources describe as a direct and unambiguous confrontation. William presented Camilla with what amounted to a demand rather than a request. She needed to publicly distance herself from Sarah Ferguson, not gradually, not through the kind of quiet cooling of contact that allows both parties to maintain the fiction that nothing has changed, but visibly and definitively. The framing, as it has been described by those with knowledge of the exchange, left no room for negotiation. This was a demand from the future king to the current queen consort. The constitutional abnormality of that dynamic cannot be overstated. In the formal architecture of the British monarchy, the heir to the throne does not issue demands to the queen consort. The hierarchy runs the other way, but the formal architecture and the operational reality have diverged significantly in recent months, and the divergence was on full display in that exchange. Charles has, according to sources familiar with the arrangement, effectively delegated authority over decisions connected to the Andrew scandal and the broader reputational management of the institution to William. Within that domain, William is not operating as an heir who has overstepped his formal role. He is operating as someone whose authority has been quietly but substantially expanded by the king himself. Camilla found herself in a position with no comfortable exit. Complying with William's demand would mean acknowledging that the future king has a legitimate claim to manage her personal relationships, a precedent whose implications extend far beyond this single friendship, and that she clearly finds both personally objectionable and institutionally inappropriate. Refusing would mean being progressively excluded from the decision-making that gives her role its substance, reduced to ceremonial appearances, while the real conversations happen around her. She is being asked to choose between her dignity and her influence, and the architecture of the situation has been arranged in such a way that she cannot preserve both. William's contingency plan, as described by sources close to him, is straightforward and not particularly merciful. If Camilla will not accept the parameters he is operating within, he will work around her. He will reduce her involvement in the decisions that matter. He will wait. He will be king. Kate will be queen consort. At that point, the question of whether Camilla ends a 50-year friendship will be moot. The institution she is fighting to maintain her influence within will have moved on to its next configuration, and the specific battle she is currently engaged in will have been resolved by the passage of time rather than by any agreement between the parties. Step back from the immediate dynamics and look at Charles's reign as a whole from the vantage point of early 2026. He inherited the throne at a moment of genuine institutional fragility. The monarchy had survived Elizabeth's death and the outpouring of public grief that followed. But the questions about its future relevance and its capacity for accountability were already pressing when he was crowned. In the 17 months between his coronation and his cancer diagnosis, he had managed to establish a sense of stability and of serious intent that many observers had not fully anticipated. And then the accumulation began. The cancer, Kate's cancer, Andrew's arrest, the accelerating transfer of authority to William, the internal conflict with Camilla. Each of these things in isolation would have been manageable. Together, they have produced a reign that looks, from the outside, less like the considered stewardship of a prepared and experienced monarch, and more like a series of crises absorbed and survived with diminishing reserves of institutional energy. The Charles who is currently reading briefings prepared by his son's team in his private study is a different figure from the Charles who stood at the altar of Westminster Abbey in May 2023 with the St. Edward's crown on his head and the weight of 1,000 years of institutional history on his shoulders. One royal source offered a characterization that has the ring of truth to it. Charles is not only helping William realize his potential, they said, but guiding him to make wise choices during this crisis. knowing that the future of the monarchy rests with the whales. The statement is generous and it is probably sincerely meant, but there is another way to read the same facts that produces a different story. A king whose heir is making the important decisions, whose wife is being managed rather than consulted, whose public appearances are increasingly managed around the constraints of ongoing cancer treatment. That king is not primarily guiding his successor. He is presiding over his own succession. Whether he chose that role willingly or whether it was constructed around him by circumstances he could not control is a question that only he can answer. And it is the kind of question that institutions prefer to leave permanently open. Project forward from the current moment, and the picture that emerges is one of a monarchy being rebuilt at speed around a single coherent vision, with all the strengths and vulnerabilities that implies. The smaller working monarchy that William envisions tighter circle of working royals, more rigorous standards for who gets to represent the crown, zero tolerance for scandal regardless of family connection, is a logical response to the specific failures that produced the Andrew crisis. An institution that had more clearly defined its boundaries, more rigorously enforced its standards of conduct, and more consistently subordinated individual protection to institutional integrity would have been less vulnerable to what happened. William's corporate monarchy is, in this reading, the rational correction to a specific and expensive institutional failure. But rational corrections applied to complex human institutions do not always produce the results they are designed to produce. The monarchy's resilience has historically come not from its clarity or its efficiency, but from its ambiguity, from the space it maintains between formal rules and human relationships, between constitutional requirement and familial warmth, between the institution and the family. The Marmite jar with the unchanged label works precisely because the label stays the same. If the contents change too visibly, too quickly, the product stops being Marmite and becomes something that people haven't yet decided whether they want. For Camilla, the next 5 years will determine what she is ultimately remembered for. The rehabilitation project that consumed the first part of her public life succeeded in the narrow sense. The title was achieved, the public acceptance was earned. Whether the second part of her story, the part that is being written right now in the conflict with William and the isolation from the center of institutional power, will add to that rehabilitation or complicate it is genuinely uncertain. A future historian looking at her tenure as queen consort will have to reckon with the specific irony of someone who spent decades demonstrating loyalty to an institution and then found that the institution's next leader did not consider loyalty a particularly relevant qualification. William, for his part, is aware that he is operating in a period when every decision he makes will be examined not only for its immediate effects, but for what it reveals about the kind of king he intends to be. The ruthlessness he has shown in managing the Andrew situation, the firmness with which he has pressed his agenda against Camilla's resistance, the speed with which he has assumed operational authority that formally still belongs to his father, all of these things will be remembered. By some, they will be remembered as the qualities that saved the monarchy from the consequences of the previous generation's failures. By others, they will be remembered as the first evidence of an approach to power that bears watching carefully. Return to the study. Charles at his desk, reading the briefing he did not commission, describing the decisions that have already been made. What is the expression on his face? It is a question that nobody outside that room can answer with certainty, but it is the question that the entire story of this particular moment in the history of the British monarchy leads toward. Because the expression on that face, whatever it is, whatever combination of emotions it contains, is the truest available measure of whether what is currently happening is a triumph or a tragedy, a graceful transition or a complicated loss, or some specific mixture of all four that does not have a clean name in any language used by the people who are professionally required to describe the royal family's internal condition. It could be relief. The relief of someone who has been carrying an impossible weight for a very long time and has finally found a way to set some of it down. Charles spent his entire adult life waiting to be king. And now that he is king, he is fighting cancer and navigating a crisis, and watching his brother's decades-long disaster reach its inevitable conclusion and managing a marriage that is under institutional pressure from every direction. The idea that his capable, prepared, strategically sophisticated son is genuinely managing the situation is not a threat in this reading. It is a mercy. It could be resignation. The quiet, undramatic acceptance of someone who understands what is happening and has concluded that there is no version of the current situation in which his authority is fully restored, and that the most dignified thing available to him is to support the transition rather than resist it. Charles has always been more philosophically inclined than politically aggressive. The acceptance of impermanence, the willingness to work within constraints rather than fight them, is not foreign to his character. Or it could be something that does not have a clean name. The specific emotional state of a person who chose something and is not entirely sure in the quietest moments of honest self-assessment, whether the choice was made freely or whether the architecture of the situation was such that it was never really a choice at all. Whether the graceful handover and the quiet displacement are actually two different things, or whether they look identical from the outside because the institution that contains them has a profound investment in making sure they always do. The monarchy is being transferred. In the formal sense, Charles remains king, and that fact will not change until he either abdicates or dies. But the institution that will exist when William is crowned has already, in its most important operational dimensions, begun to take the shape he intends for it. The question that will occupy royal historians for decades is not whether William succeeded in taking control. It is whether what he built once he had it was worth what it cost to build it, and whether the person sitting in that private study, reading that briefing, watching his son's vision become the institution's reality, agrees with that assessment, or whether he simply has too much grace and too much love for the crown he has carried to say, "What do you think? Was the transfer of power to William something Charles chose deliberately, or something that happened to him? Is the monarchy William is building the one that Britain needs, or the one that one very capable man thinks it needs? And what does history owe to Camilla, the woman who earned her title and arrived to find the role had been quietly redefined around her? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story is as unfinished as it feels, subscribe now, because it is.